Welcome to Orthodox Christian Theology. This is Craig Truglia, and with me today is Michael Witcoff, otherwise known as Brother Augustine. How are you doing, Mr. Michael?
I'm doing well, thank you. I was enjoying your intro music there.
Yeah, the best that free could buy, of course. And so this is a show I am very much looking forward to doing, and now we get to do. It's unorthodox original sin. It's a topic I haven't been able to cover in a complete show for, I think, 5 years now. And today you will be covering the topic. The lens of this will be your book, Original Sin for the Orthodox Church, and which we have right there on screen. It's a book I have read. It's a book I liked. I think it's the best book on the subject for the average lay reader. I do like Jesus Fallen, which is a much larger Christologically centered text on such a topic. And we will unpack in this interview how original sin and anthropology dovetails ultimately into Mariology and Christology. And so what we're shooting for in this interview is not like any old book interview where it's about strictly what the book says, right? You could read the book for that. You could watch all these other interviews and read reviews, and it's always about that. What we're trying to do is look in between those lines and flesh out what the book talks about, what the book doesn't talk about, what in the book may relate to these other concerns people have. And here's why I wanted to do that so much, Mike. It's because my feeling, perhaps wrongly, by the way, is that there's a lot of debate on this question. And I think a lot of this debate are two sides speaking past each other. So my goal is, as we go through this, is to ask incisive questions which will bring out whether there's common ground there's not, and really isolate what those things are. And so if you're ready, we could get going and start talking about why this book and why now.
Well, after my books on Freemasonry and fascism, I thought, hey, why don't I write something completely non-controversial that everyone will agree with, will cause no debate at all.
No, that sounds like you.
So why now? So as I put in the acknowledgments section of all of my books, my wife has learned to laugh when I tell her I'm done writing books. And every time I go, no, this time I mean it. I'm done for a while. And then 3 days later, an outline starts to form in my head of what I want to do next, because whatever ideas I've been playing with. This one in particular, you've been on the internet, you've seen what goes on. I think there is a degree to which people are talking past each other. And there's also a degree to which there are substantial differences. And of course, it also depends on the individual person talking, right? It's not quite fair to say there's this side that believes this side that believes this, never the two shall meet, because there are individual people on all sides or neither side that say things that don't really fall into neat little categories. Like, for example, I was having I guess you could call an argument with a priest on Twitter yesterday, someone I've never spoken to in person or email or anything.
Father Borjan in Pennsylvania.
Well, I wasn't going to name him, but yes, that is correct. And I was pressing him on some of the issues. I said, well, are you asserting that baptism is unnecessary for infants? And he said, no, nobody believes that. Well, there are people who believe that. There's a very popular Orthodox channel where the priest has been very explicit in saying that, which I do address in the book. Now, that particular person does great work on other topics, and I don't want to take that away from him. But that is a very that's a dangerous teaching. It's
obviously very dangerous and antithetical to the teachings of the church. Yes.
Yeah. If you believe that baptism only has a salvific effect for adults because infants have inherited no original sin from Adam that requires remission by baptism, you are under, technically, the anathema of Carthage 419, which was accepted by ecumenical councils. Every single canon, every single confession, every single catechism, every single council that's ever addressed this topic, they all say the exact same thing, which is interesting because I have been challenging people on the other side of this debate for 3 years now who are arguing with me, no, that's not, you're taking that out of context. That's a matter of interpretation. I said, okay, so for the sake of argument, and let's say you're right. Every single council, every single canon that I've discussed is completely wrong. I'm not understanding it. Let me grant you that point. Where are all the councils that say what you're saying? And to date, after 3 years of asking this question, nobody has put forth a single example from any point in the last 2,000 years. So there are people that do not really.
But they've pointed out that you're a terrible human being,
and you
lack the noetic enlightenment from
yes.
your severe ascetic life to have understanding on this question.
Correct. Growing up Jewish, Freemason, Latinizer, no phronema. Yeah, those are all sound arguments for sure. But that wasn't the question I asked them. I didn't ask about my ethnicity. I asked them about canons and councils and authoritative Orthodox sources that support their point of view. None have been offered.
Yeah, obviously it would not be enlightened to disprove a heresy, let's say, if this is what you're espousing as heresy, with some sort of ad hominem, right? Someone who's resorting to that generally lacks the wit of St. Jerome, because he'll make the ad hominem while making another point. He's just cheeky. But if you're not being cheeky, it's just because you don't have an answer.
And they're very angry too. Whatever clever insult you have is ruined by anger.
And so what motivated this book sounds like angry internet arguments, pretty much.
To some degree. And to be clear, because I've also been accused, and I'm not making this video to defend myself or anything. And, you know, my priest has been, he's had my back the entire time I've been on the internet, with all the various crusades that you've seen against me. And he's always encouraged me not to defend myself. So that's not what I'm here to do. This is just for context, because I have been accused of bringing my Western Christian errors into the church with me. When I became Orthodox, I didn't have an opinion on this topic at all. You know, I came from a very low church, Wesleyan flavored evangelical background. Once I converted to Christianity at all, we never talked about dogma, doctrine, councils. Like none of that was part of my worldview. And I was taught, okay, the Catholics believe in original sin. We believe in ancestral sin. Here's the difference. I said, okay, you know, what I didn't know any better. And it wasn't until years later when I started reading more of countless saints, you know, not just my patron, St. Augustine, but countless saints, I started to realize what people are saying does not appear to be what the saints are saying. Like what I'm hearing in contemporary debates and discussions, there seems to be a difference here. And I started at first very innocently, well-intentioned, asking questions about it, and was just viciously insulted constantly. And then the more I read and the more I understood, I started to find other people who had also noticed this, and had commented on this dynamic. And eventually it got to a point where I know people have said there's like some group of coordinated guys or something that are all doing this. Yeah, to some degree, people that agree with each other will like team up on stuff. Of course, it's what we're doing.
Well, this aside, you know, it does demand the question, you know, why you, right?
Yeah.
Why, in your position as a layman, do you feel compelled to write this? Are clergy pushing you to do it? What is the motivation, and what gives you the authority to try to settle such a question?
That's a good, amazing question. So the reason I write any of my books is simply because no one else is doing it. If someone else had done this, I wouldn't have written it. Or if people just read the saints and the councils, I would have had no reason to write this. So if people are like, well, why should I read you instead of the saints? I say, you shouldn't. Go read what the saints say. They're going to tell you the same thing that the book says. When I started doing this, obviously the first thing I did was ask my priest about it. You know, am I understanding this topic correctly? Do you agree with what I'm saying? Do you agree with the conclusion? Do I have a blessing to pursue this as a literary project? And he said yes. At that point, I started talking to other clergy that I thought might be interested to get their opinions, their feedback. And it turned out that quite a few people agreed with what I was saying. Quite a few priests that do not want to be part of the public debate.
Without any prompting, a seminary professor reached out to me. He bought, I mean, I even tell him to buy your book. He apparently, the moment it came out, he bought the book, and he was head over heels, thought this hits the nail right on the head. So that I know there's at least people that I don't even know are part of your circle at all come to me and have been saying that.
Well, I don't know how much of a circle I have, but yeah, there are priests, literally monks, even in other countries, writing to me about this that have been supporting me from the beginning on it. I will say that most of the clergy support has been from Rocor and Antioch. Overwhelmingly, it's been Rocor, which I find interesting. I don't know why exactly, but I've had priests say, I have been waiting, and this was a conversation I had over a year ago, I think. Said, I have been waiting for someone to do this. I've been hoping someone would do this. He even offered me money, like to help me have the time to write it. I said, just your blessings, please, Father. But that should show that there are clergy who understand this topic, who are dismayed by the state of the discourse that they see in public, but for very obvious reasons, they don't want to become part of the first of all, because there are priests who are teaching wrongly that I name when necessary. And as a priest themselves, criticizing other priests in public opens up a whole can of worms and that's why I don't name
you're a useful lackey. You're trying to say. Okay.
Yeah. And that's why I don't name the people that are supporting me unless they choose to identify themselves publicly. I don't want to get them in trouble. Because if they wanted to be part of the debate, they would be. So even though I was kind of the spearhead of this project, it quickly settled into, okay, I've had a lot of help from a lot of different people, including, as you said, seminary professors, people that have been seminary professors previously as well, that have been giving me feedback and guidance on this. Like, for example, a monk wrote to me who liked the book, hoping that in a future edition, perhaps I would draw more from the liturgical services. It's like, I welcome this feedback I have from the beginning. As per my discussion with you, we were on a time crunch right before it came out. If I, in a few years, go back and do another edition, I'm going to spend more time on St. Maximus, because that's one thing that I think would really benefit the work and the discussion in general. But I very much wanted to bring this book out on August 28th for obvious reasons.
And we will discuss a lot about St. Maximus later in this interview. So you said there was really no other book on this topic. So let me ask you this. What was the lay of the land, so to say, both in writing and the internet before this work? And just to kind of premise this question, my dabblings in the topic of anthropology have been in publishing on Mariology. I'm published in Revista Theologica. The same year Father John McGuckin published in that journal. So it's an academic Orthodox journal in Romania. And literally in talking about original sin, I didn't have a book to cite.
Right.
The only actual academic book, because it is used academically, let's say in Holy Trinity Seminary, book I had to cite was Jesus Fallen by Father Emmanuel Hazadokin. Everything else was from bits and pieces you get from other journal articles and the fathers themselves. There was just no book on original sin per se that I had to cite, and it might be simply because I'm not well read enough. But this is actually fairly common when you see others treating this topic, at least in the English language. And so could you tell us what the lay of the land was when you were looking to this in the internet and in writing?
Sure. So the only books, and I might get in a little bit of trouble for saying this, the only Orthodox books on this topic in English that I've found were by Vladimir Moss, the Old Calendarists. And I know some people will get upset. How can you read it? Not interested in that. His books Against Romanides and the New Soteriologists, I think are great books. Now, his position as an old calendarist means that a lot of people in communion with you and I, Craig, are going to reject it offhand, right? They're not going to read it. They're not going to take it seriously. So I wanted
the most serious Orthodox thinkers wouldn't do that automatically.
No. I think people that are a little bit more sober about everything realize that the common narrative about the old calendarists is perhaps not entirely what they were taught in catechesis. So there's a little bit more of a blurry line in some sense. I mean, obviously there's a bunch of these groups that are like a synod of one guy and his buddy or something that nobody takes seriously. But the bigger ones, as you know, Rocor gave them bishops, but that's a whole different conversation. So there were those books.
It's like, people aren't aware, but the Romanian old calendarists were in communion with the Moscow Patriarch Church of Ukraine during the 90s. So there's been a lot more interlap that people will admit. And the point is, you got to eat the fish and spit out the bones. one of the best books I've ever read on anthropology is from a Roman Catholic seminary professor, Salvation Through Temptation, by Benjamin Heidgerken. And so you have any serious thinker or intellectual is going to use whatever sources have good information. Doesn't mean they would endorse everything else the writer says. So you're essentially saying there really wasn't a lot, maybe mainstream. And
well, can I finish that thought real quick?
Sure, go right ahead.
The other sources I was able to find were Father Daniel Franzen's master's thesis, which was on this topic, and you can find published on academia.edu. He, if I'm remembering right, was a dogmatics theology professor at Jordanville. So he was someone that was in Father Michael Pomazanski's seat at a certain point. I think it was him that I'm thinking of that was in that chair. His master's thesis is very good. I cite it in the book. To some degree, the book is a much more elaborate version of the point he was making in his master's thesis. But overwhelmingly, the books in the academic milieu that address original sin, and really Pelagianism is the issue at stake here. It's all secular academics that overwhelmingly side with Pelagius. Stuart Squires, I consider one of the more educated scholars on the Pelagian controversy. Julio Malavasi has really, really good work on it. I think he just published the Oxford Handbook of Pelagianism, in fact, with some other writers. And Squires admits in his book called The Pelagian Controversy, I think it's called Enemies of Grace, The Pelagian Controversy, something like that. He acknowledges academia sides with Pelagius. There's all these people that say, maybe he wasn't rightly condemned. Maybe he was more orthodox than we thought. And this is one of many topics. It's not just original sin. It's one of many topics where Orthodox Christians that are more credential minded, let's say, they really want the letters after their name. They want to be taken as serious academics. They will be infected by what secular academia thinks. It's like this virus. And to be part of the club, they have to kind of let their boundaries of dogma down a little bit. And then I think a lot of what we're seeing is downstream of that desire to be important. Ambition really is the passion we're talking about.
Now, beyond inferring the intent of people, which I'm not personally comfortable doing, let me get back to the task at hand with this, which would be your view, your study, East and West. Are they the same on original sin? Are they different? Is there a difference in emphasis?
When you say West, are you talking about pre or post schism?
Let's talk post schism.
I don't know, because I don't spend any time studying post schism Western theology.
And so, but pre schism, you would affirm that they're the same.
I have not found to date a single example of a single saint from either the pre-schism East or West saying that the other side was wrong about this topic in a very specific sense. So in terms of the extent of the damage of original sin, I have seen some Eastern saints saying that St. Augustine took that a little too far. What I have not seen, and this is really the crux of the issue, is the fact that original sin is transmitted from Adam to his descendants, alienates us from God, and we must be reconciled to God in holy baptism specifically because of that original sin that we have inherited. That's the issue at stake that so many people debate. There is absolutely no difference between East and West, which is why, even as I point out in the book, at Florence, they spent years at Florence Ferrara nitpicking every trivial difference they could find between the two sides. And even then, 400 years after the schism, it didn't come up a single time. And I think that speaks volumes in its silence.
Now, that being said, how about you reiterate, because it seems like you were touching on the definition original sin. So could you again repeat what is original sin according to the Orthodox Church?
I would say original sin according to the Orthodox Church, if I had to put it very succinctly, I spent 270 pages trying to answer that question. If I had to be succinct, I would say the fallen state of Adam that all of his descendants inherit, and which must be remitted in holy baptism. Obviously, there are effects of the fall that remain after baptism. Nobody is suggesting otherwise, which begs the question, if things like mortality and concupiscence and corruptibility remain after baptism, then what exactly is being remitted in baptism? What's being forgiven? What is the actual difference at that point? And that's where we get more into the theology of this topic.
Now, because we're going to pack those little details, and that way, my hope is people are going to see that when we unpack those details, that there's greater commonality than they otherwise would have anticipated. I've noticed that I was cited in 2 different spots in your book, which was flattering and humbling in a sense, because like, wow, there's aren't other things to cite, and so then I actually come up in this. And so my question is, because it's going to help others to follow this channel and follow me, compare and contrast my thought versus what's in this book. Could you offer a critique of my own treatment of original sin? Or is there something that I emphasize that you think needs to be a different emphasis? Or did I get everything right?
Well, I'll actually flatter you briefly, so try and protect your noose on this one. One of the pieces of feedback I got from clergy in early drafts was someone, because you're not the only lay person I cite in the book. One of the priests said, I agree with the substance of what these lay people you're citing are saying, but just something to consider, if you cite lay people instead of, people with more authority, it might detract from the seriousness of your book.
Yeah.
And I thought about it and I said, well, that's a good point. At the same time, most of the people reading this book are going to be familiar with the people I'm talking about and who respect them and look up to them and take their views seriously. So I did decide to keep it in. But you were on the chopping block for citations briefly. No, I didn't. Your articles on the topic, specifically the damnation question of unbaptized infants, obviously caused controversy when it happened in certain circles. But your articles, I would add to the very small body of work on this topic written by Orthodox Christians in English that I think I think these are all important steps to build this edifice that I think we're all trying to build together, including this. I don't know if this is gonna be the last word on the topic. I wrote it specifically with that intention, but maybe it won't be, I don't know. I didn't see anything in your articles on the topic that I thought was wrong.
Well,
Otherwise, I wouldn't have cited you, or I would have done a little caveat after I mentioned it.
The interesting thing is, because I brought this up, because oftentimes we're used as a foil against one another.
Right.
So that's what I find so interesting, is that you're reading this and go, I agree. So there must be some difference in emphasis that I'm not fully privy to, but we're going to at least try to start unpacking this. So let's get into the theological.
Can I just address that super quick before we move on?
Yeah.
I think you're also presuming a degree of sobriety and rationality in some corners of the internet that may or may not actually be there. You might be looking for a consistency of thought where there, in fact, is not one.
Maybe I
try
to presume the best, but yes,
I do
people,
too, but
when someone's just angry, nothing they say makes sense.
Yeah.
I'm a married man. I'm very familiar with that. That being said, why do corruption and death occur? Because I think sometimes it's the why that people get hung up on. So could you tell us, why do they occur?
Well, the scriptures say the wages of sin is death. It does not say the wages of death is sin, which seems to be a teaching promoted by some people. Now, obviously, the fact of our mortality does lead us to sin more, for sure. But ultimately, the wages of sin is death. Adam and Eve sinned, damaged their nature, passed it down to us. So really, the answer to that question is because Adam and Eve lost what they had. And part of what they had was protection from corruptibility and mortality. That is what communion with God, with his energies, with his grace, makes you immune to, essentially. So when you lose that, then you fall into the sickness that results from not having that, because their nature had the potential to die or not, depending on the degree of communion with God, right? I think that's a fair way to say it. So if they stay in communion with God, they would have not just been maintained in their state, but I think even grown in it after they died, right? Because our teaching as Orthodox Christians is that those of us who make it to heaven are actually going to be in a higher state than Adam and Eve were created in. like we will have fulfilled more of the potential that they had at the time. And by losing it, they fell into the opposite, into the corruption and into the mortality that now we are born into.
Well, then how does that corruption occur? So, right, you've sinned.
Like
Is that corruption just strictly a punishment? Like, how dare you do this? I'm going to make you bad. Is it a natural consequence of sin? How does that corruption and death occur?
So St. Augustine is very clear in his work that the origin of sin is with the will. So specifically, the introduction of a gnomic will, or gnomic willing, the faculty of gnomic willing into human nature. It's not the introduction of a new kind of will. That's probably not the best way to say it. But the will going from being single-pointed and aimed toward God as our powers and passions should be, to vacillation and trying to decide between outcomes. And this was an issue I struggled with for a while, because in St. Maximus's early writings, if I'm remembering right, he believed Adam and Eve did have a gnomic will, because how else could they have chosen sin? But then later said, no, I was wrong earlier. They didn't have a gnomic will before the fall. And it was more just that they chose the sin out of like an innocent curiosity, and not necessarily a weighing of consequences between two things and then choosing the bad thing.
And if I can interject, generally, when we go even to the earliest of fathers like Irenaeus, the emphasis is on Adam and Eve were deceived. They thought they were choosing a good. So it wasn't they were vacillating between options per se.
My boy Irenaeus. I brought out the Against Heresies shirt for this video. So the short answer would be the gnomic willing.
And so what could theoretically stop corruption and death? Could anything stop corruption and death?
And this is where it gets really interesting. And now you and I have had phone conversations about this, I think going back a couple of years even.
Yes.
Because
I remember driving down a big hill on Route 20 when I was at work talking to you about this.
Yeah. Most people talk at work. So I'm not sure what any of us are really doing at work anymore, because we're all talking theology to each other.
Well, at least I was driving between stops.
There you go.
Okay.
There you go. I'm usually, I've usually been in a truck between jobs as well. So according to the rules as I understand them, somebody who is baptized and then is so full of grace and in such close communion with God that they never even have an errant thought should not technically be subject to death by necessity. I think that if we're really writing out the rules and playing out all the logical outcomes, immortality should, in theory, be a possibility. And this is where Mary comes in, right? Because the ultimate question that you and I have discussed around this whole topic, why did Mary die? That's like pivotal to this discussion. And I don't know if you want to get into that now or later, because I know
we'll get to later. But yeah, it's that we should definitely flesh this out, because it'll make much more sense when we get into that.
Yeah. So what would stop corruption and mortality would be God's grace, just like it always was and always will be.
So perfect cooperation in God's grace could end death, theoretically. And keyword theoretically, because for all practical intents and purposes, we don't know anyone.
No, I'm not sure I've ever gone 5 minutes without a vacillation of my gnomic will and some sort of errant temptation in my heart or mind or soul. But in theory, it should be possible. And this was actually part of the Pelagian debate too. I mean, I don't address it in this context.
We will unpack this when we get into Mariology. But people should just be aware that Romanides, Father Emmanuel Hatzidakis, they do speak on this topic. So if it sounds out there, it's because it's that kind of what closes the Orthodox anthropological loop. And then the harder question then becomes, all right, this is theoretically true. Why do I never see this? And we'll get into that. The short answer will be that it's selectively true for very few saints, and they voluntarily die. But we'll get into that.
Yeah. Can I add one more thing to your question you asked me?
Mm-hmm.
Because you asked, is it just a punishment, or is there some other cause of the corruption? So in St. Augustine's work, and by the way, he's always acknowledging when he's speculating, always, because his goal was to understand what he believed. And a lot of the time people are arguing with St. Augustine's work or against his thought. I mean, forgive me, but they don't even understand what question he was trying to answer or why. They don't understand his approach to the faith, why he was doing it. Like the difference in intellect is like orders of magnitude. And he understood when he was getting outside the realm of this is dogma, this is not. He was trying to understand. He said, this is the faith as I have received it. Now, how do I make sense of this? Like, why is this the faith, right? Faith seeking understanding. The name of a collection of Father Matthew Baker's essays also that I recommend, Faith Seeking Understanding. And he said that concupiscence, which I think we would probably include with gnomic willing in terms of, why we are corrupt and die, is both the punishment in terms of, many fathers speak of the sentence, the punishment, the condemnation. It's not the only word they use, but it is common in both Eastern and Western fathers.
Yes.
Concupiscence and gnomic willing, which is not a word that Augustine uses, but I mean, he would have agreed with it completely, obviously. It's both the punishment for sin and the cause of sin, is how he describes it in his work.
So is there any real difference in meaning between gnomic will, passions, and concupiscence, or no?
I think concupiscence specifically refers to desire, which would be a form of passion. Like concupiscence, I don't think would apply to anger unless you're saying that it's a desire to harm someone in response to something. Excuse me. And concupiscence itself is also not a word that means something bad. Carnal concupiscence is what they're usually referring to. Concupiscence just means desire. There's also holy concupiscence, right? The desire for God, the desire for grace, for purification. So it should be understood when we're discussing this, that when we say concupiscence, we're referring to carnal concupiscence, usually refers to lust, right? Or it could be for money.
Does it ever refer to blameless passions or just the blameworthy passions?
I have never seen concupiscence used to refer to the blameless passions. Doesn't mean it's not there. I just haven't seen it.
Yeah, in my own reading, I concur. If I could perhaps make this make sense for people, gnomic will is why there's passions. There's blameless passions, like they're not evil, that is the result of your corruptibility. We got to eat and we feel pain and all that stuff. And then there are the blameworthy passions, which are concupiscence, or however you pronounce it. And those are the passions that, instead of purifying the intellect and helping us grow holier, right? Like when we fast, that means something because we actually get hungry, right? Versus the blameworthy passions, where the existence of these don't help you whatsoever. They're an impediment to sanctification if we are not repenting of them.
Right.
And so
in Jesus Fallen, which I also reference in the book, Father Emmanuel and the other writers are very clear that Christ only took on the blameless passions. I mean, voluntarily, of course, submitting to them, but did not take on the blameworthy passions that are the cause of sin or punishment for sin.
And which is an extremely important distinction.
Yes.
And that's why he had to spell 700 pages of words to elaborate upon that. So let me ask you this. Who is the most important father on original sin?
Augustine, by an uncrossable margin. He was the spearhead against the Pelagian movement. He was the one, it was his energy primarily that resulted in the condemnation of the Pelagians over and over and over again, of Celestius, of Pelagius, of Julian, all these guys that were the leaders of the movement at various times. And when you read the other writings at the time, whether it's Marius Mercator or anyone who's ever commented on it, it's St. Augustine's work and energy and thoughts that they are referencing. Now he was.
Is that just in the West or also in the East?
No, it's both. It's completely both. He was far from the only saint involved in the controversy. There were multiple canonized popes involved. Saint Aurelius of Carthage. Was he over Carthage or all of Africa?
No, he's Carthage.
It was Carthage. That's what I thought. Yeah. He was the one that was actually convening the councils that were condemning the Pelagians, at least the ones that took place in Carthage. St. Jerome was obviously involved in this controversy as well. Every saint who was even tangentially interested in this topic sided entirely with St. Augustine, with no equivocation, no qualification against the Pelagians. In the East, when his work was received, it was received with nothing but praise and adulation. You look at St. Photius's work in his Bibliotheca. I know there's an article floating around that's full of complete gibberish about how Photius was against St. Augustine and the heretic on original sin. It's just lies. I mean, at some point you could say this is just innocent ignorance. But the things that article claims are disgusting, accusing Augustine of saying that Christ had original sin. Not only did he never say that, which is why the authors of that article and those promoting it cannot provide a single example of him saying it, he said the opposite every time he ever addressed the issue. He said that Christ was the only person not born with original sin. So he did not believe in the Immaculate Conception, or at least if he did, I certainly never saw it mentioned.
And Augustine had a very specific mechanism as why that was true. He would consistently cite Romans 8:3, though existing the form of man in the likeness of sinful man. Right. And he would say, well, he was born virginally, and so he voluntarily assumed these things, but he really wasn't sinful.
And all the fathers share that opinion. In the Bibliotheca, St. Photius consistently defends St. Augustine's views on original sin against the Pelagians. Obviously, the Rudder by St. Nicodemus, if I remember right, there are almost 60 references to St. Augustine in the Rudder, every single one of them positive. He makes references specifically to St. Augustine's books on original sin, referring to Augustine as divine in that context. St. Prosper obviously was also involved in all this a little bit later, to be fair. But there are no examples. There are no examples of Eastern Orthodox saints disputing the basics of original sin as found in Augustine. Obviously, the councils, every time they brushed up on this topic, they accepted his work as put forth at Carthage.
Well, which councils and which one was the most important on this topic?
So technically Carthage 418, but 419 was when the African Code was compiled. And then there was over 100 canons from different Carthaginian councils. Not all of the canons were accepted in the East. Like there were canons about clerical celibacy, for example, that were not accepted, that were part of the African Code.
And that's why the numbering in the Greek and the Latin is different.
Right. And there's a footnote on the canon to original sin that is found in Latin, but not Greek as well. Not that it really changes too much of the context, but it's a little bit harsher than you usually find in the East. But St. Augustine's teaching, as articulated at Carthage 418 specifically, as included in Carthage 419, the African Code that was compiled, was accepted at Trullo, which was then ratified further by the Seventh Ecumenical Council.
Do we have any other binding conciliar statements that expound in Augustinian anthropology?
Literally all of them.
Well, name them.
Okay, well, that's what the book is for, Craig. No, we can go through them. So I know there's an ecumenical council, technically is supposed to have an emperor, right? And then pan-Orthodox, but it really, for all intents and purposes, these are both authoritative, right? Ecumenical council or pan-Orthodox council. There was Yash, there was the Confession of Dositheus, even the Council of Crete in 2016, which is not binding on all Orthodox Christians because half the Orthodox world was not represented there. But the jurisdictions that did sign off on that, except these later councils like Dositheus and Yash, there was a Moscow one as well. I mean, it's literally every time a council has ever addressed this stuff, whether binding or not. So like the earliest council on this topic was Carthage 252, St. Cyprian, right? And there's a very vocal sect on the internet that says St. Cyprian's ecclesiology, he understood it, his sacramental theology, like this was accepted, this is universal, but then they don't accept his teaching on this topic. So really it's like a buffet, a pick and choose buffet from St. Cyprian. And that was over a century before St. Augustine, well over a century before. So this idea that St. Augustine invented some new Western heresy doctrine unheard of in the church, this is all just based on ignorance. People just don't actually do the work to find out what's been said. And in this debate online, I can't tell you how many times I've been criticized by people saying Romanides was right about Augustine, they haven't read any Romanides and they haven't read any Augustine. They're sheepishly kind of parroting something they saw in a blog post, or their favorite YouTube e-celeb guru said something and they want to, be on that guy's team or something. And they speak so zealously about these things that they have no idea about. It's very bizarre, because I can't think of another topic in either the religious or secular realm where someone who has never done, 5 minutes of research into a topic positions themselves as an authoritative expert. It's very weird. It's very weird to watch. But all the councils, whether of pan-Orthodox or even local authority, like Orange, Second Orange, it would be another one like Carthage 252, they all say the exact same thing, which is why I said at the beginning, there are simply no examples of councils that disagree with St. Augustine's view of original sin. No. Even Father Borjan, because you named him in this debate that I was having.
And he's a great man. We were visiting Hershey, Pennsylvania, and went to the closest Orthodox church for Sunday liturgy, and walked in, and it was like walking into like a first, second century liturgy, just the zeal, and everyone's so close together. And we weren't expecting this in a random Serbian church in the middle of the Rust Belt. And then people start saying, "Oh, I know who you are," and I had no clue. I walked into influencers church, so. But it was great meeting everybody.
Thankfully, there's enough room in this town for all of us, I think. But no, I mean, he was quoting Decree 6 of Dositheus as if it was, disproving all the Augustinian things. And I said, why don't you post Decree 16 too, as long as we're claiming authority for this council? Because Augustine is named as an authority on infant baptism in that section, and it concurs entirely with his view. So this comes back to people not really knowing either what the Eastern councils say or what St. Augustine actually taught, because many people are taught a caricature of what he taught that does not reflect his actual writings as understood or interpreted by the saints and councils ever.
Now, Father Borjan, and I'd say most clergy are very knowledgeable, and they're not going to question something like Council Jerusalem 1672 or something like that. It's that's something that they understand as authoritative. But popularly, people do reject these councils. So what is their basis for rejecting, let's say, Yassi 1642 or Jerusalem 1672?
They don't like it.
Other than not liking it, they must give a different reason other than they don't like it.
There are certain words that they throw out. I mean, that is the reason. They just don't like what the councils say. I wish it were more complicated. I wish it were more serious. It isn't. They like to throw out words like context and interpretation are some of their favorite things.
So they would accept the council, but just say that you're interpreting out of context.
Well, no, because when you then respond with, okay, well, what is the correct interpretation of this that you agree with? Or what is the context that you're saying changes the meaning? They move on to another thread, or they call you a Latinizer and block you. So it's not like they have a base of knowledge that they're approaching this from. They're just coming up with different like catchphrases for why they reject them.
And I just want to add something before we kind of change the topic a tiny bit, which would be, if I've heard popularly that St. Augustine is a saint because of his repentance, not his theology. Mm-hmm. The common response is that, well, the Fifth Council accepts all the writings of Augustine and other writers, including Theophilus of Alexandria and stuff like this. I feel that sometimes is taken out of context, that such a statement about canonical writings, generally speaking, in the ecumenical councils, are the ones that are quoted by the council. They're not saying everything that man ever wrote. Right. But here's a tidbit that no one's probably ever heard before, which is St. Augustine's Anthropology is cited as authority in Session 8 of Constantinople III, because it's the only ecumenical council as of yet that's not fully translated into English. No one's aware of that. But this does come up when they are debating the confession of Macarius of Antioch, Monothelites confession, and he cites Augustine, and then they cite Augustine against him. So it's not just in St. Agatha's letter where he cites Fathers East and West, and of course, including Augustine, but also the Eastern participants also cite Augustine on the same question. So this is something that people, again, it's because I don't like meme apologetics. Just be aware that Augustine is cited as a father teaching theology, specifically teaching anthropology, and it's cited as an authority in the Sixth Council. And lamentably, St. Maximus isn't cited once in the Sixth Council because he was condemned by the Council, Constantinople in 662, and that was only 19 years later. They didn't want to upset the apple cart over St. Maximus' memory at that juncture anyway. So I figured I'd just add that.
No, I appreciate that. It should be noted because, and this is related to what you said, there's another meme going around that, first of all, St. Augustine couldn't speak Greek, which is interesting because he translates sermons from Saints Basil and John Chrysostom from Greek into Latin and against Julian, word for word. But that his books were unknown in the East. They weren't translated for 1,000 years. Well, his biographer, Posidius, who he lived with and was his friend in the monastery, Bishop Posidius, said in the 5th century that his books were already being translated into Greek overseas and were being circulated throughout the entire Christian world by the end of the 5th century. Now, Posidius does not, and this is taking this from
clearly not all of them, though, right? Augustine's
that's
got
the
volumes.
thing. Right. That's the thing. He doesn't give a table of contents or like an index of, hey, these are the books specifically. But we know that at least some of his work was available in Greece, like probably during his lifetime. So it's just not true that the East had not heard of him for 1,000 years.
It's also worth bringing up what was considered East and West back then were different borderlines than today. So like Sicily would have been considered Eastern because it was Greek and they spoke Greek. And so you would get people in Sicily, because it's in between Carthage and Rome, that would have loved Augustine. But
those good old Eastern Orthodox Italians.
There you go. We was Orthodox, right? Now, let me ask you this question, because I personally feel, and we spoke about this a few years ago on this channel, that there are things that St. Augustine says that are suspect. I think it's letter 98, if I remember right. He gives speculations on transducinianism that the reason, so when he quotes Ezekiel 18 and essentially argues it's the soul that sins that dies, and that's why we all die. We all have a soul that had original sin.
Is this the letter to Jerome that you're referring to?
No, I don't think so. I think it's someone different. But that being said, unless you want to argue that everything Augustine ever wrote on the topic is correct, which maybe you want to argue, is there a difference? And you could say no between the private speculation of Augustine and maybe what we could properly term canonical Augustine, like clearly Carthage 419 and any of the canons that are entailed there, we have to accept. Is there a difference?
So I want to address that letter 98 thing first, and then I'll answer that question. St. Augustine was agnostic on the origin of the soul. He did play around with different ideas at different times. And sometimes when he's being quoted as saying, look, this is what he believes, it was actually just him doing a thought experiment and kind of parsing something out to see if it made sense. His letter to Jerome is the one where he asks Jerome to teach him about the origin of the soul. He said, here's I think it was 4 possibilities that I can see making sense. And I think Jerome ignored him. I don't think he wrote him back, if I remember right. But even at the end of his life in the retractations, and people often look at the retractations and they will claim that he rebuked all of his previous ideas. Once again, they haven't read it.
Yeah, that's true.
That's not what the book is. There's like 1 or 2 small things that he retracts. Even then, he says that he didn't know when he was writing his letters on the origin of the soul whether traducianism was true, and still doesn't know. So he never actually took this is my position stance on the origin of the soul, even though he did speculate and toy with different ideas just to try and figure it out to himself over time.
So it would be fair to say anything transducinianist would be private speculation Augustine, not canonical Augustine.
Yeah, and even St. John of Kronstadt made comments that sound fairly pretty traducian. Father Michael Pomazansky points out in Orthodox dogmatic theology that the origin of the soul is not actually a revealed truth to us. We don't actually know whether every soul is created brand new or whether it does derive in some sense from the souls of the parents, and that would mean all the way back to the original soul. We really don't know. There are some, I think Traducianism is not a common, certainly not a majority position in the saints, but I've seen people say, oh, St. Augustine believed in original sin because he was a Traducian. This is nonsense. That's not. He gives so many different kinds of proofs in his work, proofs from scripture, florilegia from other saints. I mean, he really uses all of his weapons and ammo in trying to disprove Julian, and it worked, right? Julian was deposed as a bishop and exiled from Italy. So it worked. He used all kinds of arguments. You can't hinge.
So what do you
on
say against
Traducianism.
Julian would be his most important set of books on this question?
I would start with On Marriage and Concupiscence. I think it's a much shorter work. There's a giant volume called the Anti-Pelagian Writings that does not include against Julian, but it includes a bunch of other things. I think against Julian is wonderful. He was actually working on another book against Julian, but he didn't finish it. He really did not like Julian, and they had a back and forth criticizing each other. It was pretty heated, more heated than you usually see in the fathers. But I don't know if people realize this. He'd also been a tutor to Julian. He knew his father, and he had sent him his book on music earlier in his life. So it was kind of personal for him that this kid that he knew and helped teach was now turning against him and trying to deceive the church.
The question is, because Augustine also complains about the people he was tutoring in the Confessions. The question is whether he got paid, because he left Rome because he wasn't being paid, and he left Carthage because he felt the students were substandard. So they
were pretty rowdy in Carthage. Yeah. So I don't know whether he was getting paid. I'm sure Julian's dad paid him for the.
Maybe he was rowdy though. Maybe he was rowdy.
I don't know. I really don't know.
Now, earlier you said Augustine is our most important father, and you may like tea and I like coffee, or you like Arabica coffee bean, I like Robusto coffee bean. It's a matter of prerogative, your own personal prerogative on a question like that. And so clearly there is in this book, at least my own reading, a preference for Augustinian language and an Augustinian apologetic. In the truest sense of apologetic, right? You're giving a defense of the Augustinian doctrine of original sin.
Right.
Now, there may appear to be a lack of Maximus anthropology in the book, like we talked about, and you even said part 2, there'd be more in this.
Yeah.
Maximus is quoted to corroborate the patristic, and by the way, Augustinian view that original sin's propagated via copulation. Right. I just want to add as a comment, the fact that's even for some reason people get angry over this and start calling you names. It's like, you just haven't read the fathers. Right. That's just such a common
Many
idea.
Such cases.
Like I wouldn't even think of such a thing if I didn't read it in so many fathers, right? We live in 2025. It's just not something you think about unless it was in the fathers. In fact, I first ran into it, not in Augustine, but in other fathers.
Well, can I weigh in on that for 2 seconds before you finish the question? Because this ties into what I was saying earlier about how when people insult Augustine or this doctrine of the transmission of sin, they don't even understand what question was being addressed at the time. The question being addressed, the reason St. Augustine wrote about it, speculated on it, what the fathers wrote about it, the question was, how can 2 parents who are baptized Christians give birth to a child who has original sin? Why does the child of baptized parents, why is that kid born corruptible and mortal? That is the question that they were trying to answer. Because if they've been purified of original sin, how can they pass it on? It's a very logical question, right? It's a great question. And the answer was there has to be some passion involved in the marital act, or the damaging of the seed was another speculation put forth, but that came from the passion of the man. There must be something about the act of conception, the pain, the pleasure that's all involved in it, that is not perfectly in alignment with God, that would prevent the corruption and mortality from coming along with the conception. So that's the important point that I was making earlier. We have to understand why they were even talking about this to understand the bigger picture of the topic.
Yeah, I've brought up to Roman Catholics because we don't believe in an immaculate conception of Mary, but we do believe in a dispassionate conception of Mary.
Yeah.
And we'll get into this a little bit. Your book, and it's actually quite refreshing, talks about there is something different about Mary and her relation to sin that's not like us.
Especially St. Paisios said he had a vision about it, and
there's saints on this question. And so, yes, she wasn't conceived with pleasure, and this is one of the means in which original sins passed forward. but also she was birthed in pain. We don't know any father that teaches otherwise. And so the pleasure and pain is what creates this cycle. And so this is something that is kind of implicit in this whole thing about original sin is via copulation. You think in your morning prayer saying Psalm 50 that, I was conceived in sin, mother's womb, that this wouldn't be some sort of debate there. But back to Maximus, there is this lack of emphasis in Maximus in the book. His anthropology undergirds the Sixth Council. As I said, he's not named in it, but the whole logic, the Sixth Council, is from Lateran 649, and Lateran 649 was pretty much written by Maximus. St. John of Damascus, who systematized Maximus' thought, also doesn't have a large emphasis in this book. He cited as conceptually teaching original justice, which for our viewers' sake is a tentative state of immortality that Adam and Eve enjoyed, tentative upon their continued obedience to God. But that said, Damascus is also cited invoking the proceeding and saying that God condemned us to the destruction of death in order that what was evil might not be immortal. And you see that also in the St. Cyril of Alexandria, the idea that God allowed death to occur so we wouldn't be trapped immortally, like with our concupiscence and our passions. We wouldn't have this.
And in better science fiction, we actually see that played out, where the people that want to live forever just become more and more evil and horrible over time.
Science fiction's never wrong. So that being said, right, in my view, because it's interesting, your emphasis on Augustine, and if in my published work, it's on Maximus and the Damascene, that they are the backbone. And so my question is, are we emphasizing the end sum of original sin, condemnation to death in this book of yours at the cost, the therapeutic aspect that creates this end sum, the gnomic will divorcing us from divinizing grace, which causes corruption in the passions, right? And so it seems to me the book's emphasis doesn't touch upon this therapeutic aspect, original sin, which seems to be the larger emphasis in the Damascene and Maximus. So let me give you some opportunity to comment on that.
No, that's entirely correct. And I say in both the intro and conclusion of this book that I'm not, actually I say in the conclusion specifically, I'm not saying everyone needs to say original sin instead of ancestral sin. I'm not saying everyone needs to use the language of guilt and the language of Augustine. That's never been my point, never been my intention. My point is that his language and imagery and metaphors, which is really the ones used mostly by the West, but also by the East frequently, is perfectly orthodox. That's my whole point. We can't say this stuff is a heresy. We can't say this is some Augustinian wickedness, root of all evil nonsense like you see in Romanides and things of that nature, like writings of that nature and the people downstream of him. Because then you not only condemn all the Western saints, but you condemn all the Eastern Orthodox saints also who use the same language. There's definitely more of an emphasis on that sort of forensic legal language in the West than there is in the East. And there's definitely more emphasis on the therapeutic healing language in the East than in the West. But both sides use both paradigms. It's really just a question of emphasis. My argument that I make in the introduction of my book is there's nothing wrong with this, because they're talking to different audiences and trying to use the language that's familiar to people. And St. Paul does this. This is the point I make. St. Paul's letter to the Romans is obviously much more legalistic and juridical than his pastoral epistle to Timothy or Titus, right? They're very different imagery being used. That doesn't mean he's preaching two different gospels. It means he's making different points in the language of the audience. And St. Paul makes this point. He says, to the Jews, I became a Jew. To the Greeks, I became a Greek, so that by all possible means I might save some. So he says, this is my rhetorical strategy. I want to speak to my audience effectively. He's just an effective communicator is all that means. Anyone who's ever been in sales or marketing or advertising understands you speak to your audience in their language. Anyone who's ever tried to get a message across, because in some sense it's all the same, right? Sales, oratory, apologetics, there's a lot of overlap there. If you insist on speaking in one particular set of images that your audience does not resonate with, you're just going to lose them, even if the point you're making is correct, right? Because they're going to be like, well, this doesn't match my worldview. This isn't how I think of things. So no, I would say this book definitely, as a defense of St. Augustine's view, as accepted by both the East and the West, tends more towards that language because those are the books that I'm citing and the work that I'm working from. But ultimately, the therapeutic and the forensic language is all preaching the same gospel. And I even make this point, this other point, I think it was in the conclusion, where there's a big difference between putting out a book or a YouTube video to a general audience and what a priest has to do in a one-on-one spiritual counsel. And depending on the person in front of him and their state and their anxieties or lack thereof, at different times, you would want to sharpen one set of images and dull the other. So
absolutely,
the specific example I use, it's in the infant baptism section.
Yeah, the infant baptism, the death of people like relatives that aren't Orthodox, but they're otherwise Christians. Like, right. Obviously, this explains the difference in emphasis.
Right. You would want to emphasize the fact that we have services and prayers for the dead and even for people that died outside of the church. But if you have an Orthodox woman or who claims to be Orthodox that confesses a new abortion every 6 months, you're going to probably want to use the language of hellfire and condemnation a little bit more because she is stiff-necked and needs that rod of justice or truth. And the softer, it's okay, we love everyone, that's not really helpful for her, right? She's in very serious danger. And it's up to each priest, if they're good with pastoral care. And again, this goes right back to what I was saying. You have to know your audience and understand what's going to be helpful for them. If you use the wrong imagery or the wrong language with the wrong person, you can really hurt them actually and set them back significantly. So you really have to know what you're doing. But yes, short answer, this book certainly does not emphasize the therapeutic stuff. I mean, I have other work that goes into it and like essays that I write and stuff. But for the purpose of this book and this topic, there's certainly more of that Western language used than I may normally do.
No, I appreciate your acknowledgement of that, and your reasoning behind it is definitely solid. One thing I've observed, and it's not just you, it's clergy also I'm in touch with, is that there's a tendency for both sides to emphasize either just condemnation or just the therapeutic side. Why is there this sort of reticence to holistically combine them? Maybe I do so. I'm not sure where you would consider me on the spectrum, whether I'm way more therapeutic. I don't think
you're just the worst.
Oh, well, the reason is because my actual attempt is I actually try to attempt the holistic one.
Right.
Like at least that's what the article's called. So,
right.
That's the intent. Whether I got there's another question. But why, despite maybe failing in our intent, why do most people just tend to just focus on one side? Why do you think that is?
I think that a lot of people, if they convert to Eastern Orthodoxy from a Western Christian denomination, that's a stupid word, group, let's say. I don't like the word denomination anymore. It seems to be even more so the case with like Calvinist Reform type groups. A lot of their zeal for Orthodoxy is actually just anti-Calvinism or anti-Catholicism. And so what they like about Orthodoxy is that it's not Western, rightly or wrongly. Yeah. And so even if the content of what they're saying is correct, their bitterness and their malice and their spite is very, very transparent, I think, to a discerning listener. And so I think in their effort to separate themselves from this Western thing, they go way, way overboard, and not just being unbalanced, but going so far as to throw away teachings that the Eastern Fathers also taught. Like if you think we don't never use words about sentence and condemnation, like go read St. Athanasius, go read St. Simeon, the New Theologian. Okay. Read any of them. It's there. It's always been there from the beginning in the East, in Greek, and everywhere else. I think it's probably, and I don't mean to sound insulting when I say this, I think it's probably a reflection of their general mental state and approach to life and whatever cognitive distortions they are dealing with in their lives. Because if I had to guess, it's not the only area of their lives in which they have this sort of black and white, one side versus the other side point of view.
Well, I think that's also particularly very, very American and very Western European. Having visited Asia for many times. I know that's not how people operate there. And when
Yeah.
I read ancient history, it's clearly not how they talk and how they act.
No, and that's the most important point. The people who talk like this, I don't think deeply read either the writings or the lives of the saints. Because if you do that, you're not going to find this sort of dialectic. And where you do, first of all, it's more accurate. And second of all, it's dispassionate. And both of these traits are missing from this hyperzealous anti-Western flavor of, quote, orthodoxy. They're angry. It's very obvious.
Well, let me push back a tiny bit, because I do notice among the people that try to push some of the more Western-oriented name whatever pet idea here, because there's more than one kind. I noticed the same tendencies among those people as well. So
I would agree.
It does speak to a larger societal issue that seems to those people then bring that into the church, because the society is what we're, where we're trying people from.
Yeah, and there's imbalance on both sides for sure. And as the leader of the Latinizing, blaspheming heretics, my cult might be upset to hear me say that, as I've been, accused of. But no, it's true. I've certainly seen some imbalance on the other side as well. But if you read the fathers, you find both sets of language, and you might not even agree. You might not even prefer to use it yourself. But at the very least, you can't say this is a heresy. And this is
you have to accept it. You have to accept it as legitimate, that this is a legitimate way of pronounce words for me, but of explaining a particular kind of theology.
And this is the point Father Seraphim Rose makes towards the end of The Place of Blessed Augustine in the Orthodox Church, which I don't think is a perfect book, but I think it's a very good and important book, and one that I recommend everybody read. There's stuff I would have liked to see that wasn't in there, but it's crucial. I think the service at the back is great. He makes the point that those who use the language of Augustine are not as in danger of losing grace as the people that are so correct about it that they're condemning the people doing it. He warns that this anti-Augustine movement is a precursor to schism, is another phrase that he uses. And people will cite his book that are making all the mistakes that he's warning against, which I find very interesting. I think it's just a question of maturity, I think, at the end of the day, for people on both sides to be like, no, only my team is right. This team is bad. You must say it like this and not like that. And that's what I was trying to avoid with this book.
Now, in exegeting Romans 6:11-12, St. John Chrysostom states, he came, that's Christ, not to destroy our nature, but to set our free choice right. For it's absurd for those who are being conducted to the kingdom of heaven to have sin impress over them, and for those who are called to reign with Christ to choose to be captives of sin. It is possible even for one with a mortal body not to sin. Do you see the abundancy of Christ's grace? He continues on Romans 6:18, I placed, he, that's God might say, all the passions and subject to you by baptism. And so this is in his homily 11 in Romans for those who want to read more on it. So being that we talked about that the passions create this corruptibility and death, why do infants and adults sin after being baptized? I mean, theoretically, according to St. John Chrysostom, it's possible for us not to at all.
It is. And this was a really important point made against the Pelagians that I don't get into at all in this book because it's a different aspect of Pelagianism. But the possibility of perfectibility is very important because Christ says, go ye and be perfect. So if Christ commanded it, we can't say that it's theoretically impossible. We can say that no one really gets there, but we have to acknowledge the possibility of being perfect. As to why adults sin, I think there's a wide number of reasons. I think people want to sin. They enjoy the pleasure of it in some capacity, depending on the sin, of course. Weak prayer life, they don't go to church. They're not, what prevents us from sinning is the indwelling of grace, really, right? Because when we're having those moments where we're just there, and we feel full of God, we feel his presence, we recognize he's there, like sin doesn't even occur to you in those moments. It's not even like you're lifted above that place where all that stuff even happens. Of course, that state comes and goes, right? And that's to train us in how to learn to fight temptation when grace is not there, suppressing it for us. This is according to Archimandrite Zacharias. He's got some great books on this topic. Now, as to the passions being implanted, so I've seen different perspectives on this, and it kind of depends how you mean it. There's a perspective in which the passions, if we're talking about the negative temptations and whatnot, are a result of the fall. But there's another sense that I've seen in other writings where the passions are actually natural to us, but they're just not aimed in the right position. Like your passions, like your will, your desire, your zeal. Those are natural powers of the soul that are meant to be pointed towards God. And in our ideal state, they are, but the fall just disfigures them, and now they're pointed at external things instead. So I've seen both of those paradigms explained. You said, why do infants sin? I don't think infants do sin. I mean, I have never seen
they grow up to sin, right? So this is the very interesting thing, is that with baptism, we could say, for example, Cyril Jerusalem says in his third catechetical lecture, neither does he that is baptized with water, but not found worthy of the Spirit, receive the grace in perfection, right? So with adults, there seems to be this rationale that, well, you get some sort of grace, but you're not getting perfect grace because you're not going in there with perfect motivations.
Into baptism, you're talking about?
Into baptism, right? So there's some sort of degree of synergy. But with infants, right, they go in there and they don't know what they're thinking.
Right. It's our faith that counts as their faith, essentially,
Yes.
Which is why that whole big gay baptism issue in Greece was such a big deal. I'm sure you know the event I'm talking about.
Yes. Yep.
God help those kids, man.
So it does seem to me that the rationale which applies to the baptism of adults could be applied to children, but it's difficult. It's more difficult to apply.
Here is the paradigm of baptism that really resonates with me and that I find very beautiful. I don't remember what saint I read it in. The idea was, in holy baptism, obviously all of your sins are wiped out, right? Original and personal sin, both totally wiped out, or in infants, it would only be original sin. And every gift that God could possibly give you is implanted in baptism in that moment when you come out of the font. But those gifts, they don't express themselves because of our remaining passions or concupiscence or the darkened thoughts we have. But the idea was that we don't accrue more gifts throughout life, through our purification and growth in Christ. It's more that we just get out of the way of what God already gave us. And I really like that. I don't know if that's dogma or a common thing, but I really, really like that. So
another
angle. It's that we go into baptism with errant thoughts, because all of that is instantly gone, but the errant thoughts that remain instantly darken what we got in baptism. That's more of how I would think about it.
Now, this might be another angle to kind of get at the same thing, which is, why does God allow us to struggle with these things after baptism, and even more so, why not, if the idea is, as at least some people claim, to make everyone go to heaven, why not let everyone who gets baptized die right afterwards? What in his providence, why is that not what occurs?
Those are wonderful questions. St. Augustine obviously tried to answer it, because in his work, which is thousands of pages of anti-Pelagian writings altogether, he asked that question. Why do these things? Why doesn't baptism just make us immortal? And one of his explanations he gave was, well, if baptism just made us immortal, everyone would just become Christian and get baptized for the completely wrong reasons. So part of it would be an incentivization question to make sure that, if you're going to enter the church, live the life of the church, it's out of your love for God, your desire for God, and not just for the material benefit of physical immortality. I haven't seen other saints commenting on this question at all. Doesn't mean it's not there. I just haven't seen it. As for why concupiscence and the passions remain, I think it's training. Like, let's say that you're baptized and then you come out of the font and you're killed immediately, or you drop dead. You're going to go to heaven, right? Because you have no sins at all at that point. But you're not going to have a bigger mansion that you would have had by the training of spiritual warfare and your asceticism and your overcoming of the passions over time. Jesus says in his Father's house there are many mansions. And if you read through visions people have had of the afterlife, like I think her name was St. Theodora, the story told in Departure of the Soul about the toll houses.
Yeah, St. Basil the New.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's a very convicting story, her story. And she sees the different mansions and the glory that people at different levels of deification, if you want to call it that way, had. So God gives us the opportunity for those of us that he allows to live for long lives after baptism, to grow in virtue. Doesn't mean we're going to do it, but he gives us the opportunity to do it.
Yeah, I think your book mentions these things give us opportunities to get crowns, so to say.
Yeah.
And there's no victory without overcoming some sort of adversity. In the scriptures,
no crown without a cross.
There in the scriptures, there's the story of Saint Hezekiah, the righteous, and he has the grace withdrawn from him. And it says in the scripture, so God could see what's in his heart. And what is in his heart is, it's not the most horrible thing ever, but it's not the most righteous thing ever either. And so I think what we see, and we're going to pack some as we get to Mariology, is certain graces that are withdrawn or not given in their completeness motivate the righteous to seek God all the more.
Yes.
Instead of like we see with some of the Israelite Judahite kings, right? They'll seek the doctors instead of seeking God, seek alliances instead of seeking God in these different things. And then they don't merit crowns for those things. And so I feel a lot of this has to pertain to God is not some sort of necessarily quantity over quality. Right? The idea isn't just everyone go to heaven, but it's, they're just not that close to him because they didn't synergize that intensely with him in this life. God wants quality. God took particular pleasure in the Theotokos because of the quality of her faith. And that's what we're being called to, is to begin to start living lives like hers. So what makes me think that something that you quoted in the book, you quote Archimandrite Zacharias saying that St. Maximus the Confessor says that those who receive baptism and do not sin after that should not normally die, not even a physical death. Still, God allows that they die, but their death is a condemnation of death, just as Christ's death was a condemnation of death. Now, you observe after quoting him that thus, we must understand that when the Orthodox Church hymns Mary as sinless, pure, and immaculate, the Holy Spirit is expressing his pleasure in her successfully overcoming the same sinful impulses, tendencies, and passions which are the common lot of man. If we are to harmonize the thoughts of St. Paisos, which you read in a previous chapter, the rest of the Orthodox saints, we may say at most that perhaps these tendencies were not as powerful in her as they are you and I. These hymns do not mean she was free of the stain of original sin. So with this in mind, why did Mary die?
This is something we can only speculate about. When you and I discuss this, the things that I've seen, obviously, to condemn death, right? That's what the death of the saints does, to humiliate Satan. One other idea would be that obviously you're going to be closer to God in the afterlife than here in the flesh. So she could go to God because he wanted to be closer to her, or she wanted to be closer to him. And I've also seen the concept that, well, if you really want to follow Christ, that means all the way, right? You follow him all the way to death and then into the afterlife. So if she really wanted to follow her son, then that means that she would have to die like he did and then someday be resurrected like he was. And this is an area of theology that I consider like the really high octave, where we just have to be super, super careful, not make dogmatic pronouncements or decrees, not say this is the right answer. Because this is like I said earlier, this is kind of the crux of the original sin question, is why did Mary die? What do you think? What do you think are some reasons? Because those three are the ones that I've seen and thought about.
In studying Mariology, we're given just very plainly, because I'm published in the Byzantine Dormition narrative, so they're all about her death.
Right.
And I'm probably the most well-read person in this topic in the English language. And so the little
I'm
I've
very
read,
humble about it.
well, maybe, right? Yeah, right. But I say that simply to point out, I've read this as exhaustively as I could read it. And you will find the explicit rationale that the Theotokos wanted to follow her son in all things. And that would include death. So just on a very plain level, it would be this desire to be like Christ.
What other saints besides Maximus have you found talking about this topic?
Well, you even find this among the Monophysites and stuff. Jacob Sarug talks about it. Like, I'll quote Jacob Sarug. He talks about that Mary's death was voluntary, and that death came to Mary so that she might taste his cup, the Lord's cup. Right? So there's a mass acknowledgement of this in all of Christendom when they grapple with why Mary died. And so to me, it's the meta question that's never addressed in this tradition, which would be, all right, she wanted to do this. Why was this even possible? Again, she could have been immortal right off the bat. Why did God let her stumble per se when she had doubts at the cross? This is something we find in all the Orthodox fathers and stuff like this. And a lot of this, I feel, pertains to what we see with Hezekiah. And you don't see the direct connection. We do see in the Dormition narratives that when Mary shows weakness, it's more, what's the term for us? It's more pedagogical for us that we could see the difference between sinless humanity versus, someone who didn't commit sin, but from Adam's stock. So sometimes this stuff is emphasized even in her life in order to draw the contrast between her and Christ. But in my overthinking mind, and maybe this is where your mind's racing, it is, well, then why did God withdraw that grace from her? Right? Like, why did he have to do that? She never committed sin. She was the most faithful person there ever was on this earth. And again, that's that meta question. And that's why I feel what Augustine says about this is given so we may attain crowns makes sense. If you never had to deal with doubt, how do you merit the crown for overcoming doubt and having faith despite of it? Right. Yeah. So these are things where you'd see God in his wisdom may impose deprivation so that in overcoming it, we may merit something for it. Because to take this away from the Theotokos, to quote St. John Maximus, is to take away her greatest merit. Right. If we make a Theotokos that didn't overcome original sin, but rather was exempt from it, you just took away her greatest merit, because she didn't even have to die. She overcame sin and all its facets. And
St. John Maximovich makes that point in the veneration of the Mother of God, that it takes away, like, why would we venerate someone for not sinning who wasn't tempted at all in the first place? There's nothing to venerate about that.
It's I'll just quote St. Nicholas Capasilas, where he states in his nativity homily that she came from the earth, from the fallen human race that had given her her own nature. But despite this, he says, she overcame all evils from the beginning to the end, uncovering the true human nature as it was originally created, escaping the common disease, being just human and without receiving anything more than other men. Right? So if we make it where she wasn't dealing with the problems that original sin would cause, then all those praises we just ascribed to her wouldn't even apply anymore. And that was something I didn't understand years ago reading St. John Maximovich that I do understand now.
And to some degree, I mean, if we're going to say she was preserved of original sin, to some degree, there's like an infinite regression of immaculateness. Like, okay, then Joachim and Anna would have had to have something special. Then each of their parents would have had to have something special.
And Aquinas makes his argument, by the way.
All the way. Oh, does he? All the way back to the beginning. Well, I've read parts of the shorter Summa, but besides that, I'm not very familiar with Aquinas.
Now, that said, and we touched this early in the interview, the Theotokos was conceived without pleasure, but born in pain. right? So
as far as we know,
So how was Mary not quite dealing with original sin the same way we were? And in what way was she?
I don't have a good answer to that, Craig, because St. Paisios's comment on it, and there are comments, fleeting comments in other fathers about how there was maybe something different, but I have never seen them go into specific detail. And I am very hesitant to speculate on details that I have not found in the saints. That's why I was so careful with my wording when I said we may say at most that perhaps she wasn't dealing with them quite the way we were. I've certainly not seen anything as elaborate as St. Paisios's vision as recorded by Hieromonk Isaac, his disciple. And I think, so a dispassionate conception is, I think, the ideal, right? Like even for us, that is the ideal. And interestingly, St. Augustine is one of the only fathers I've read who thought that sex would have happened in paradise, but dispassionately. A lot of other fathers thought that sexual reproduction was a faculty.
Saint Maximus, for example, is very explicit on that. But St. John in Damascus is also very explicit that birth would have still occurred the way it occurs now.
Oh, okay. So he was also on that page. We have to also remember.
But remember, that could be painless because the Theotokos had a painless virginal birth. So it makes sense.
Well, and we know that the pain of childbirth was an effect of the fall. So whatever the method of reproduction in paradise, it would have been a painless birth for sure. I think we have to remember that bodies were of a different quality in paradise also. So even if, like a dispassionate conception between Adam and Eve, there would still be a qualitative difference between that and a dispassionate conception of us, who have these thick, fleshy bodies that need food in a different way and digest in a different way. Right. And now we're kind of getting into that created in incorruption set of lectures that I really actually love from the St. Herman Brotherhood. So it would have been different anyway. I think maybe the way that Joachim and Anna conceived was like the best that we can do in our fallen state. But as to the specifics of, okay, let's get into the nitty gritty of what this meant for the Theotokos, I have to go with St. Augustine's answer whenever he was asked a question that he didn't have a good answer to. Oh, the depth and the riches.
Yeah, I would add for anyone who's tantalized on the question that clearly just like a good upbringing helps a child. She was helped in some way. The detail wouldn't be emphasized in the hagiographies if she wasn't. Exactly the nature of that help, what we could say, what it was not, was an exception from sin. Original sin, simply because, like we just read in St. Nicholas Cabasilas, and I could quote other fathers, that they choose to emphasize that, like St. John Damascus, behold the virgin, daughter of Adam and mother of God, because of Adam she commits her body to the earth, right? So they still say, well, that's because she was born as we are, that she still has to go through the things we go through. But there's in other respects, other instances of grace which appear to preclude the Theotokos from what could have been other potential avenues for sin if it weren't for those grace. So it doesn't appear that her conception would have removed all possibility for any sort of thing that's problematic. You just never find that in the fathers. In fact, you'll find details that are the opposite. But it definitely helped. It definitely helped. And which then speaks to the fact that a passionate conception doesn't help. And this speaks to the larger ascetic tradition, which again, it scandalizes people, but for some reason, the issue of marital fasting has become some sort of debate, which is strange given that we have ecumenical councils like Concil 920, which will be published on, yes, it was ecumenical, but even if you don't accept that, its canons on fourth marriage and its decree is authoritative in the entirety of the Orthodox Church, that there are these sexual mores traditionally in the Orthodox Church. Again, if you're Roman Catholic or you're unaware of this, it might sound bizarre There's a great article on this by Father John Meyendorff, by the way, if you want to know more about what they wear and the details of them. But the idea that like on a fast day, you'd be fasting from meat, alcohol, and relations. I've even had liberal priests say that. I don't know why this has become a debate the last 5 years. It's a fast
debate.
It shouldn't be up to debate. I mean, it's a fast day. No one's saying you can never sleep with your wife.
Yeah.
That's no one's position. It's saying it's a fast day. Don't do it right before communion, things like that. And so why is this relevant to this question? We had a bishop actually have charges pressed against him for saying that those who were violating this fast or not keeping the marriage bed holy, like it talks about, I think it's Hebrews 13, had consequences on the children. And so the passions in conception, according to the traditions of church, do have some consequence that you might not always know exactly what the results of those things could be. And if you follow the rules, don't expect that means you're going to have a perfect child either. This is very complicated, but we're just speaking very generally of what the church teaches. And hopefully soon, it should be in a month or so, Constable 920 will be published, and people will have a lot more detail on that question and specifically what the entire Pentarchy accepted when it comes to that question. Now, let me ask you one last question.
Sure.
Because I think it's a good way of summarizing the importance of your book and a lot of the thought. And I feel this interview being a great companion to what's in the book, because it fleshes out a lot more stuff. Why is the Theotokos and the Lord himself the very center of the doctrine of original sin? It just seems like you can't talk about this question without having immediate applications and ramifications among Mariology and Christology. It just seems like all discussions revert back to both of them. Why is that, and what's the importance of that?
Because when you look through the fathers, they're so consistent that Christ was the only one born without original sin. That has so many implications on our anthropology, on our view of passions and temptation and spiritual warfare. And that's why I think Jesus Fallen was such a crucial and important book, maybe a little longer than it needed to be to make the points it was making. But he really wanted to go into every single detail and every single related topic. And I think he did a really amazing job of it. Because
he was hoping for it to be a textbook. You could tell the way it's written.
Yeah.
He wanted every seminary to be giving those students every semester.
Yeah. Well, it's not the only book of his I own. I also have the Heavenly Banquet, which I think should be necessary reading for anyone that goes to a divine liturgy. It's very, very good. There's a lot of people that believe that Christ was fallen, and they don't understand. Like, they just assume it. I don't think they've studied it and come to this conclusion.
Yeah, it's from movies and stuff.
Yeah. So many movies are so terrible. So many Christian movies are terrible. I tried to watch one with Christian Bale, and what was the thing that made me hate it and stop watching it? It was some sort of like overt Nestorianism.
Christian Bale was in a Christian movie?
He was.
Wasn't he in the Exodus movie, Gods and Kings?
I think he was Moses. Yeah.
But that's not the movie you're talking about, is it?
No, that was a fun one. I liked Exodus, Gods and Kings.
I actually like that movie. That we could have a whole stream on that, because it's not a good movie theologically, that's for sure, but it's a fun movie.
No. I'm down to do a movie stream sometime.
There you go.
If we don't understand we have to understand who Christ is. That's like the most important thing. Our faith is named after him. We should probably know about him, right? So first we have to get to the point of seeing that he's made in his human self, human body, created in the likeness of sinful flesh, but not actually sinful flesh, right? That word likeness is important. He looks like us and talks like us. There would be no point. I shouldn't say no point. The fathers that address this talk about his being conceived the way he was, specifically to avoid the consequences of original sin. They're pretty clear on that connection there.
Yes.
So we have his fallenness or lack thereof is connected to his conception, which is connected to the question of what effect does conception have or not have, depending on how it's done, which is connected to the topic of how was he conceived compared to how other people are conceived. I mean, it's all related. And what I was trying to do with this book was kind of flesh out every thread and not leave anything unanswered. Like no more what ifs, no more, well, what about this? I'm sure I didn't succeed completely, but I did my best. I did my best by the grace of God to answer all of these things. There are questions that you can't address without also addressing these other topics. Like you can't address, in some flavors of Protestantism, you can't address predestination without addressing monergism, right? These topics they're intrinsically related. For original sin, conception, birth, sex, the Theotokos, infant baptism especially, right? The fate of unbaptized infants is also an absolutely crucial thing we have to talk about. You can't address any of these topics without also fleshing out the others if you want to actually understand what we believe and why. This is what the church has passed down to us. This is what we have received from divine revelation. If we want to understand what we believe, then we have to actually do the work to look at these different topics and see how the pieces fit together. Now, do I think that this is necessary? I don't know. Some illiterate peasant farmer that just has a simple trust in God is probably going to go a lot farther than me. I acknowledge that. But with the kind of mind that I have that requires satisfaction of understanding what I believe and why, if you're going to do it, you have to do it all the way. You can't do half of this journey, I think.
Now, before we close, give people an idea of anything that you feel we haven't touched in the interview that would be relevant about your book, and then let people know where they could get it.
So the book is Original Sin for the Orthodox Church. Cover made by Arbalest Editing Services, who has done the covers for my other books on the Masons and their lies and fascism viewed from the cross. He always makes really excellent covers. It's on Amazon. I had plans to do an audiobook. I spent hours and hours and hours nitpicking little audio editor stuff, and then it rejected it anyway and said something about background noise, at which point I stopped caring. I don't have the time for what they're demanding of me. So it's available in Kindle, hardcover, and paperback. It was top new release in several categories, in canon law, in religious essays. We beat David Bentley Hart's new book for a while, which was nice to see on top new releases for religious essays. Now, with that said, when DBH is on point, I think his writing is absolutely beautiful. I really enjoy reading some of it. So I don't know what his new book is about. I just saw that he was number 2 and we were number 1 there, which was cool. So those 3 formats, it is, let's see, 273 pages, I want to say. 264 pages before the bibliography. The Florilegium at the back goes through, what is this, almost 100 pages? Let me see. The Florilegium is about 60 pages long, beginning with the Old Testament, going through saints from every century that I could find writings on. And this is just quotes. This is what some would call a quote mine, but the fathers call a Florilegium. Without commentary, just here's what the saints say. Here's what the saints say. The section before that goes into the theology, like what
any tactful today. Interpolations like we had in ancient times in your Florilegium?
It's just the quotes.
Kidding.
Just the quotes. And then the first section of the book,
when you study the ancient Florilegiums, and there's debates whether is this rendering accurate or not. So this is fun.
No, I left that out. I tried to address all the real questions in the meat of the book. And the first section just goes through all the canons and councils that have ever been translated into English that in any way, shape, or form addressed original sin. If you're interested in the topic, I tried to make something for you that I thought would answer all of your questions and really get you up to speed on the topic. If you are set in your beliefs and don't want to believe that anything in here is relevant, you don't have to read it. I've had people say, well, why should I read your book if I believe this, that, and the other thing? I said, you don't have to, man. It's a free country. Do what you want. I spoke to Metropolitan Jonah for about an hour and a half last night, not about this topic at all, completely unrelated. And he had a quote that I wrote down. I wrote down many of the things he said. He said that orthodoxy is about radical, unconditional freedom. You do not control people or try to control them. You put the truth in front of them. Do your best to love them with that truth and let them make their own decisions. If you want to read the book, it's there for you. If you don't want to read the book, you don't have to read it. Totally up to you. I wrote it to be the be-all, end-all on this topic, to try and solve all of the questions people have been debating online. God willing, and with the help of my friends and my editor, who you're all looking at right now, I did a good job. I missed something. I missed a format. I made a formatting mistake in the table of contents, which I didn't catch till afterwards, where it says Book 2, Theology. I pulled it back to be in line with the rest, and I forgot to add some more ellipses. Forgive me. God lets us do these things to stay humble. But yeah, I think you guys will like the book. I tried to be not very polemic or mean. I really tried to be sober and just dispassionate about it. Here's what the councils say. Here's what the saints say. Do what you want to do.
So really Original Sin for the Orthodox Church on Amazon.com.
Yep.
And so please check it out there. It's a good book, informative book. I feel very, and I would say no matter how you feel about the book, its overview of the Pelagian controversy and the scholarship of it is very highly useful. Will end up being cited in many a master's thesis for that reason alone. I've noticed when people come up to me, they're like, "Oh, I'm writing a paper for this class. I'm using Rise and Fall of the Papacy." So it's books like this, if they review scholarship on popular questions, it will be used for this, and it's very useful for that. So for that alone, I think it's worth purchasing, and should be in the shelves of the library so people could have quick access to this information.
I had a subdeacon reach out and say that he's the catechist for his parish, and he's going to be using this as the source material for his catechism around these topics too. So you can either read the book or you might hear it in person without knowing where the material comes from.
There you go. It's like throwing a pebble in the pond and those waves go out.
That's the idea.
Well, Michael, it's been so good having you talking about the book. I hope people got to hear some things fleshed out in a context which they otherwise haven't heard it, and that this would be greatly edifying them. It's been very helpful for me to also hear this fleshed out, as always is like in our conversation. So thank you so much for coming on.
Of course. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity, and God willing, the work that you and I slave away at will be helpful to people, because that's the idea, right? I know people think that orthodoxy is some path to riches if you make YouTube and books, but you and I both know this is a labor of love.
I lose money.
If you were to actually divide up the hours and the money lost, I'm sure I'd do too.
Yeah. I'm not talking about even hours. I spend money doing this.
Oh, there you go.
I
spent money on sometimes on audio voiceovers or like covers and stuff, but I try to avoid spending too much. Well, yeah, God willing, God called us to do
we're
these
two
things.
Jews talking about money. I might as well plug the mission in Cambodia, right? Why do I lose money doing this? If you got any money left over after buying Michael's book, Original Sin for the Orthodox Church, please consider, if this show has blessed you, supporting the mission in Cambodia at orthodoxchristiantheology.com/donate. Links are below. Consider becoming a missionary. We just want people to serve. Apologetics, evangelism. It's just one small way I could serve God's people, to evangelize, bring people into the church. And why wouldn't we want to do this? God paid the ultimate price for us. He sent his one and only son to die, and in our place on the cross. So to me, no brainer, support missions work. Edify yourself, of course, learning theology, getting closer to God, but put that theology into practice and serve God. One way you can do that, orthodoxchristiantheology.com/donate. Links are below. So that being said, great having you on. I will end this show, as I end all of them, by quoting Jesus the Rock: "Fight to death for the truth. The Lord God will fight for you." God bless you. Have a great day.
Thank you, Craig.